everyone to the Wicked Problems and Responsible Leadership session. If you could just put the previous slide up, please. Yeah, not that one, the next one. And I'll just introduce myself as Professor Mike Sachs. I'm chair of the Institute for Responsible Leadership, and I'm also Emeritus Professor at the University of Suffolk and visiting professors at a range of institutions, including Westminster, York, and Toronto. So I'm delighted to be here with you as not only chair of the Institute, but also chair of this session. And I'm delighted to say, we could have the next slide, please, that we have a fantastic array of international speakers. Do we have the next slide? Basically, I'll give a brief introduction and be followed by Alex Maillard, who I'll introduce, Professor Keith Grint, who is an absolute expert on this particular area. Can you just stay with the previous slide, please? And then we have a number of panelists, James M. Durant III, Professor Brian Head, and Professor Joanna Murphy. And basically, then we'll have questions and answers. So I'll follow the chat. So please do put any questions that you have for the main speaker and indeed any of the panelists up online. And then I'll give some closing remarks just to move us forward. So next slide, please. And so the next slide is for Alex Maillard, who is a really good friend of mine. He's also director of the Division for People and Social Inclusion at UNITAR. And in addition to that, he also is the head of the CFAL network, which extends globally, across the planet, which is really good. And Alex has very kindly recorded a range of commentary on the Wicked Problems and Responsible Leadership format. But before we go on to that, I would just like to say that Wicked Problems in the context of this webinar relate to complex interconnected challenges that are not easily resolved. They go beyond traditional problem-solving methods, and they defy, if you like, straightforward solutions. And intrinsic to them is that they require leadership in taking them forward. There's no simple kind of management response. There's no simple, command response as there would be with critical problems. We'll learn more about this later, but basically they are complex. And in fact, when I was thinking about this webinar, I was very much considering a book I read in the 1970s, which was a science fiction book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was very well starred at the time. And in this book, after a whole range of issues across the universe, it said at the end by the supercomputer involved that basically the great questions of life, the great questions of the world, and the great questions of everything are actually reducible to the number 42. And I would definitely say that it would be fantastic if we could reduce all these wicked problems to 42, or to any number for that matter. But actually, this isn't the case. And we wrestle with these wicked problems, all of us. And I felt I've wrestled with more than enough in my own career in universities and the private public sector. But what I would say is that they are central to the issues that the United Nations is facing, particularly with the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, which I think is a very wicked problem, given the whole range of them. And so I'm really delighted to pass on to this recording that Alex Maillard has made for us in terms of his role at UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, in taking us forward through some of these issues, at least providing some skirmishing before we get into the real considerations of dealing with them, as will be expounded by our speaker, our keynote speaker, and indeed the panelists. So can we switch to Alex's video, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished friends and colleagues, I want to welcome you on behalf of UNITAR, the United Nations Agency for Training and Research, to this very important workshop that we are co-organizing with the Institute on Responsible Leadership. This webinar, as you know, is entitled Wicked Problems and Responsible Leadership. I would like to share with you a couple of comments as we commemorate the importance of this event. I would like to begin by expressing our gratitude to Dr. Mike Sachs, the director of the Institute, whose support to UNITAR and the United Nations has been invaluable for us. Now, wicked problems. They are indeed complex, interconnected issues that resist straightforward solutions. They are multifaceted and dynamic interactions. They sometimes lack definitions, involve diverse stakeholders, conflicting interests, and they are indeed a challenge. But in creating responsible leaders, we have to understand that these interconnected challenges require visionary, adaptive, and ethical leadership. Responsible leaders must carry the ability to navigate ambiguity, uncertainty, and systemic barriers inherent to wicked problems, while upholding principles of integrity, empathy, and sustainability. By dealing with these problems, leaders gain invaluable insights into the complexities of real-world issues and develop the resilience, the creativity, and the collaboration skills necessary to drive this type of change. Now, I want to also invite you to think that in several decision-making processes, we need to prioritize long-term societal well-being over short-term gains. These type of problems are deeply intertwined with the Sustainable Development Goals, as they encompass complex, interconnected challenges that hinder progress towards accomplishing the 2030 Agenda. Problems like climate change, poverty, and inequality defy simple solutions due to their multifaceted nature and systemic drivers. Remember that addressing wicked problems requires holistic approaches that consider social, economic, and environmental factors, aligning closely with the integrated framework of the SDGs. Also, many of the SDGs directly intersect with the wicked problems, with the big challenges of society, and they serve as targets for addressing specific aspects of the solutions. Therefore, tackling wicked problems effectively is essential for our societies. I would also like to tell you and invite you to think that these type of problems are directly linked with what we call ESG, environmental, social, and governance frameworks. They have profound impacts on these dimensions of sustainability and governance. They indeed help us to focus on the importance of metrics, of public policy, on better practices, but on top of all of that, on responsible leadership to implement these solutions. Having said so, failure to address these problems will necessarily, I have to tell you, create risks for companies and societies. ESG remains at the center of the solutions, and responsible leadership plays a pivotal role in navigating these wicked problems. I would also like to say that transparency, accountability, ethical practices, and all these virtuous things that we can develop in ourselves and then we can implement in the solutions remain critical. Remember that to become a responsible leader, we have to commit to address them proactively, guided by principles of integrity, emotional intelligence, and sustainability as a whole. Leaders who embrace responsible leadership understand the importance of collaboration, innovation, inclusion, and stakeholder engagement in tackling these problems effectively. By fostering a culture of accountability, inclusivity, and continuous learning, responsible leaders inspire collective action and drive meaningful change towards addressing wicked problems and building a more sustainable and equitable future for all. In closing, I extend my sincere appreciation to Dr. Mike Sachs and everyone at the Institute for Responsible Leadership for their continued commitment towards the United Nations mandate and goals, and for their support to UNITAR. As we begin the panel discussion, I am very confident that the extras that you are going to hear will inform you on what you need to do to become the agent of change that you should be for society, so you can indeed deal with wicked problems. On behalf of UNITAR, thank you to all of you and congratulations. Ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Alex. That's fine words. Obviously, integrity is a byword, and ethics, which I think we'll hear more about a little later. But for the moment, what I'd like to do is to introduce Professor Keith Grint, who is Emeritus Professor at Warwick University. He has an incredible profile, worldwide profile in the area of leadership, and also in terms of wicked problems. He's published incredibly widely, a whole series of books in these kinds of areas, and he's held chairs at a variety of places, including Warwick, Cranfield, and Lancaster. These are full chairs, and he's also been director of the research at the University of Oxford, the Side Business School, the business school there. And he spent a number of years there. And this has no doubt mellowed him in terms of approaching this issue. And so really over to you, Keith. Thank you very much for agreeing to be the keynote speaker. We're very honored.
Thank you very much, Mike. Can we have the first slide up, please? Okay, so wicked problems and responsible leadership. Next slide, please. So to begin with, I'd like you all to start thinking about which kind of problem you are currently wrestling with. These are the sustainable development issues for the UN, but there are always lots of other kinds of problems that are worth thinking about, mainly at work, but sometimes domestically. I'm not sure I've ever been able to solve a domestic problem, but we can always hope. So just hold this problem, whatever it is, in your head as we go through these slides. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this is a graph from one of Richard Pascal's books. It looks at change programs across time. This is from 1950 to 2000, but if you go from 2000 to 2024, you get a very similar response. So just about every year we get a new change program, which in theory makes change much easier than it used to be. So we can see from the 1950s, we only had 3 ways to help people change in the 1950s. So change must have been really hard then. And once we get past 1960, change gets easier and easier every year. That's the theory, which also implies that if you have a change program this year, the best thing you can do is leave it till next year, because there'll be a new change program, make it even easier than it was this year. That's the theory. Next slide, please. So what are the consequences of that? Is something like this. This represents change programs in the National Health Service in England, in the UK. So the UK NHS is the 5th largest organization in the entire world, the largest organization in Europe. And you don't need to know any details about the NHS, the health service. All you need to think about is it looks like we restructure it every year. And to be honest, we do restructure it every year. And nobody knows why. I think it might be seen to be doing something approach to life. Normally, restructuring doesn't damage an organization very much because the people that work in the organization don't usually care very much what the structure is. They just come in, do the work, go home again. I'm not quite sure where we're going with the health service. Next slide, please. Not just large organizations that suffer from this. This is my department in Warwick Business School between the years 2009, 2013. So 4 years, 6 name changes that coincide with 6 new heads of department. It's got to be a coincidence. My personal favourite was the penultimate one. In 2013, we were Organisation and International Human Resource Management. That lasted for 1 day. But what a day. We were international. Some of us got as far as Heathrow Airport before the boss had been removed, and we got a new boss and told to go back and report for duty. Next slide, please. We end up doing this on the left. We're drowning in the waves of change. And one of the only rational responses I've ever come across to this panoply of changes is on the right-hand side. Bohica, bend over, here it comes again. Next slide, please. So a few years ago, a couple of my PhD students were looking at change literature independently of each other, and they both came to the same conclusion. Most of it says something like this top 10 list for change. Need to change, viable alternatives, change agents in place, sponsorship from above, realistic scale, integrated transition, symbolic end, plan for resistance, constant advocacy, locally owned benefits plan. So the thing about the list is, first of all, it does actually make sense. It's kind of intuitively obvious you should be doing this kind of stuff. But the real problem is what comes in the next slide. Next slide, please. So despite the fact that we know what to do, something like 3/4 of all change programs fail in their own terms. So when you ask most people, what were you trying to do and did you achieve it? Most people say, no, we failed again, which is weird because we do know what to do. We've just seen what you're supposed to do. So how come we can't make it work? Next slide, please. I think one of the reasons is that when we make something work, we develop a kind of universal model of change in our heads. Or maybe there isn't a universal model of change. Maybe there are different kinds of requirements for different kinds of problems. I'm going to suggest we have critical problems for coercive command by an individual. We have tame problems for management, and we have wicked problems for responsible collective leadership. Before we go any further, let me just say that this is just a heuristic. This is a sense-making activity. It's not reality. I recognize there are more than 100 kinds of problems and 100 kinds of decision styles, but my little head cannot cope with numbers beyond 3. So 3 it is. Next slide, please. So let's start with the land of the commander. First thing to think about, it has to be portrayed as a self-evident crisis. If people don't believe it's a crisis, then you can't command them in the way that I'm talking about command. Secondly, there's general uncertainty. So the reason we have a crisis because most people don't know what to do. If they knew what to do, there wouldn't be a crisis. So it's the absence of standard operating procedures generates the crisis. You as the commander have to know what to do, otherwise you're a failed commander. 3, no time for discussion or dissent. So we're not worrying here about health and safety stuff or management procedures. If you don't do what I'm about to tell you, you're going to lose your life or lose your job. We're in those kinds of situations. Because of the first 3 can coerce people. As long as they think there's a crisis, you are the commander with the answer in your head, and you're doing it for the collective good. If they thought you were commanding them for your private gain, they might try and resist you. I'm associating those with command. Many organizations are run by commanders, not just uniformed organizations. Lots of them are run by people who are very decisive. They're often decisively wrong, but at least they're decisive. So we've got some images of commanders here. On the left-hand side, Mrs. Thatcher, archetypal British political commander. When she was in control of the UK, we were always in a crisis. I could never work out whether she was causing them or responding to them, but we were always in a crisis. On the right-hand side, we have images of political commanders dressed in military uniform. I think that says something about their own self-perception. I think they all thought of themselves as commanders, as very decisive people, for whom the world's either black or it's white, it's never grey. So we have different kinds of crises. We have financial crisis. We have all the crises that we just looked at and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is Edgware Road Station on the left-hand side where a bomb went off, 2005. And I want to use the next person along, who's my eldest daughter, as a way of illustrating this model in a domestic situation. So about 10 years ago, I'm hosting the extended Grint family Christmas lunch. We have about 20 people in my house. And you know, at some point today, there's going to be a catastrophe. The question is, how long can you keep normality running for on Christmas Day? So we start eating lunch about 1 o'clock, and by 1:25, I've lost the will to live. And the main reason is my mother, who has been entertaining us again, this time, with a 25-minute speech about her latest knee operation. I'm looking at my turkey leg thinking, I can't eat that now. Nor do I know how to get out of the situation. But luckily, I'm sitting by my father, who was in the army for about 150 years. So he'll have met this scenario a few times. So I whispered to him, Dad, can you shut her up? He said to me much too loudly for my liking, you're the host, you try shutting her up. Now, I don't want to die by this woman's hand at this point in my life, so I don't do anything. I just look at my turkey leg and I begin to pray to it. Within a minute, my prayers are answered by Katie, my eldest daughter, this woman's granddaughter, who said to my mother, Nanny, my mother stopped mid-sentence and she said, yes, dear. And Katie said, get a grip. She did. She shut up talking. We had quite a nice Christmas lunch. So self-evident crisis, general uncertainty, not in the commander's head, not in Katie's head. She's the one with the answer, not me. No time for discussion or dissent. She doesn't lean over and whisper in my ear, Dad, will it be okay if I abuse your mother? Otherwise, we're never going to get through this lunch. She just did it. And because it's for the public good, it's legitimate coercion. So the commander's role is to take the required decisive action. That is to provide the answer to the problem. Next slide, please. So I want to capture that way of thinking about decision making with this creature, albino elephant, white elephant. In Thai culture, a white elephant was treated as a god, omniscient and omnipotent. In my culture, in the UK, British culture, we treat white elephants as false gods. Look great, cost a fortune, don't do a damn thing. Number two also comes from Thai culture, because if a white elephant was born, it was given by the Thai king to his least favored noble. And so expensive was it to feed that it would ruin the noble. So if you're a Thai noble and you wake up and there's a white elephant on your lawn, you're finished. I'm going to suggest you do need to be number one, Thomas. You need to be godlike in your ability to coerce people. If there is a crisis, you are the commander with the answer in your head, and you're doing it for the collective good. But some of us think we are gods, and then we end up with number two. Next slide, please. So why do we end up with number two? Why do we end up with permanent commanders rather than temporary commanders? I think the main thing is that we confuse confidence with competence. We assume that anybody that looks like they know what they're talking about knows what they're talking about. This is a complete error. This is an error on our part. This is our problem. We confuse confidence with competence. What we don't like to do is elect or appoint people that appear not to be confident. But we like people who are confident, even if they have got no idea what they're talking about. Next slide, please. So what about IQ? Surely IQ is critical for leadership. Well, the best estimate I've ever seen between intelligence and leadership suggests that the connection is about 4% at most. In other words, organizations are full of people who are quite intelligent, but not in leadership positions. And organizations are led by leaders who are not especially intelligent. So why don't we get smarter leaders? Because, as I said, we're attracted to confidence, charismatics, and narcissists more than intelligent people. Because impression management is more important than anything else. The ability to look like you know what you're talking about. And thirdly, because Machiavellians trump moralists. We would hope that our organizations are run by moralists, but by and large, they tend to be run by people who are much more Machiavellian. Next slide, please. Second category of problem. These are tame problems. These are problems for management, as I'm defining management. A tame problem is the equivalent of a puzzle. There's always a solution to a puzzle. That's why it's called a puzzle. And there's always a solution to a tame problem if it is a tame problem. These can be complicated, but they're not complex. So you can take them out of their context, fix them, put them back into the context. You haven't changed the context. You can't do that with the complex one that we'll look at in a minute. There will be a unilinear solution to each and every tame problem. There will be a standard operating procedure for every tame problem. So a Rubik's Cube is a good example of this. It's a puzzle, it's a tame problem, and there's a standard operating procedure for fixing it. Next slide, please. This is what the SOP for a problem of this nature looks like. If you know this, you can fix the Rubik's Cube quite quickly. If you don't know it, you will eventually fix it, but it will take you a long time. Next slide, please. So these problems that probably management spend most of their time dealing with, which means if you don't know how to fix it, somebody next to you will know how to fix it. And if they don't, there'll be a book which says, this is how you fix this problem. So heart surgery is a good example of a tame medical problem. If you're a trained heart surgeon in a contemporary hospital, it's a very complicated procedure, but most people survive the procedure and therefore it's fixable. If I am doing your heart surgery, you don't have a tame problem. You have a critical problem because I've got no idea what I'm doing, which tells you the categorization of the problem is subjective, not objective. It depends where you sit and what you know, what kind of a problem you're looking at. So heart surgery to a heart surgeon is tame, but it isn't to anybody else. Relocating is a tame domestic problem. This is very stressful, but the more you do this, the easier it becomes. If it's about efficiency, if there's a tick list involved, it will almost certainly be a tame problem. So management's role is to engage the appropriate process to solve the tame problem. Next slide, please. I want to capture that way of thinking about decision making with this man, Frederick Taylor, father of scientific management, which he published in 1911. For Taylor, if you applied science properly, you can solve all the world's problems. I think you can solve all the world's tame problems through the appliance of science, but not all the world's problems are tame. Next slide, please. The third category of problems are wicked problems. These are problems for leadership as I am defining leadership. I don't have simple solutions. Sometimes I don't have any solutions. They're either novel or they're recalcitrant. They're novel, they're new to you, so you can't know what to do, which also means somebody else in the room might know what to do because to them it might be a tame problem, or they're recalcitrant. Had this problem over and over again, and for some reason you can't fix it. So these are complex rather than complicated. You can't solve them in isolation when you try to, you generate other kinds of problems. So climate change is a good example of a contemporary wicked problem, and the first generation of biofuels was an attempt to tame that problem. But what that did is take 25% of American agricultural land out of food production, led to food price increases, food shortages, without fixing climate change. This is typical. When you try and tame wicked problems, you often generate other problems downstream that you weren't even thinking about when you began the taming process. Often don't have any stopping rules and therefore no definition of success. So crime will always be with us. I don't know any society which is large scale or long lived that doesn't have crime. So if your target is zero crime, you're wasting everybody's time. You can make crime better and you can make it worse, but you don't seem to be able to fix it. It seems to be part of the human condition. But the trick is to work out how you might manage it better rather than how you pretend to fix it. Sometimes the solution precedes the problem analysis. This sounds a bit weird. I've got 3 grown-up children. When they were growing up with a big problem once, I can remember saying to them, listen up, kids, this is the solution to this problem. And one of my children said, that isn't the problem. But not until I put the solution on the table did I flush the problem out. So sometimes you have to work with a partial solution because you haven't quite worked out what the problem actually is. So they might just be intransigent. You might just have to learn to live with them. Symptoms of deep divisions, contradictory certitudes. People are absolutely certain in completely different directions about what to do about every wicked problem. What to do about Gaza, what to do about Ukraine. People are absolutely certain in completely different directions. They're not to have any right or wrong solution, just better or worse developments. Uncertainty and ambiguity are inevitable. We don't like these. We tend to reward people who are good at removing uncertainty and ambiguity. But I'm going to suggest you can't know what to do with a wicked problem, because if you know what to do, it isn't a wicked problem. Your job, therefore, is to get used to uncertainty and learn to live with the ambiguity. This is what Keats the poet called negative capability. This is the ability not to make a decision, to stand back and to reflect on this. How long have I got before I need to make a decision? Well, you might have 10 minutes or 10 weeks or 10 years. You should take all this time. If you get this decision wrong, we are all screwed forever. Let's stop being so decisive all the time. That would be the land of the commander. That would be positive capability, where you do need to be decisive, and you need to be decisive now. You need to be able to do both. These are problems for leadership, not management. There's no known processes for these kinds of problems, and there's no point in you acting like a commander and pretending you know the answer, because you can't know the answer. If you know the answer, it isn't a wicked problem. Your job, therefore, is to engage in high levels of questioning. But we tend to reward people who are good with answers, not questions. It's also to engage in high levels of collaboration. I mean, there might be somebody who does know the answer, because to them it's a tame problem. But if not, it's a wicked problem. We need to start a conversation. This is a land replete with failure. Because you can't know what to do with a wicked problem, what you're about to do might also fail. And we know that one of the main reasons that organizations and countries can't cope with wicked problems is because they can't cope with failures. They punish people that make mistakes rather than using them as a learning opportunity. We also know that the inability to cope with complexity and ambiguity seems to be linked to dogmatism and political extremism. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's a question. What kind of a problem do you think COVID was? I think COVID is one of those issues where actually all 3 problems are wrapped up together. So part of it was wicked at the beginning, i.e. in terms of, what are we supposed to be doing with this? It's Certainly in our country, in my country, we didn't know what to do. Secondly, it's also tame in terms of managing the vaccination program. That was a tame problem rolled out to management. And thirdly, it's also critical. It required coercion. You will not go to work. You will wear a face mask. You won't have a party unless it's in Downing Street, in which case it might be okay. So when you've got these kinds of issues where there are multiple problems embedded together, then the real problem is inconsistency. I cannot tell you the number of times people have said to me, what I like amongst my leaders is consistency. Actually, I don't. What I like is inconsistency between different categories of problem, but consistency within the categories of problem. And for that to work, you have to have the same language. You have to have a common language to be able to persuade people first thing in the morning, this is a crisis. I'm not asking for your help. I'm telling you something. And in the afternoon, we have a wicked problem. I don't know what to do. I'd like your help. And somebody will say, Keith, you're being completely inconsistent. And what I like is consistency amongst my leaders. If you have the same language, then you can get round this problem. But what the language does is enable you to say things that you're not normally allowed to say. So as the appointed leader, you can't normally say, do you know what? I've no idea what I'm doing. But you can when you've all agreed what a wicked problem is. Next slide, please. There's an example of the difference between a wicked problem and a tame problem. These are high jump records across time. Between 1900 and 1996, the measures in inches. So between 1920 and 1952, the most popular technique is the Western roll. And you don't seem to be able to get beyond 80 inches using this technique. So, sorry, can you go back to the other one? So if you're looking at 1953 and thinking about winning the 1956 Olympic gold medal for the high jump, it doesn't actually matter how efficiently you train at the Western roll. If you want to win the medal, stop doing the Western roll. So many of us have been struggling with Western roll problems in the last few years. These are problems of efficiency, how you get more out of less. Comes a point in time when you can't get more out of less. You have to get different out of less. Furthermore, there's no point in you being efficient at the wrong task. It took us to work out what you are prepared to stop doing, to sacrifice, to enable you to do what you need to do. So the Western roll is a tame problem of efficiency, and it's the wrong problem. And the switch from the Western roll to the straddle, that is a wicked problem. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, some wicked problems are linked to so-called progress traps because human ingenuity is good enough in solving a problem, but inadvertently, sorry, can you go back to the previous one? Inadvertently creates another problem. So oil solves transport, manufacturing, and heating problems, but destabilizes the climate. And medicine enables humans to live longer, but destabilizes the health system. So we have to be constantly wary of these kinds of issues. Next slide, please. So they're also locked into blame cultures or sweep it under the carpet school of leadership. So we'll start on the top. You made a mistake. Will it show? Yes. Can you hide it? Sorry. You made a mistake. Will it show? No. Can you? If you don't, let me start again. You made a mistake. Will it show? No. Bury it. Problem avoided. You've made a mistake. Will it show? Yes. Can you hide it? Yes. Until before somebody else finds out. Problem avoided. Will it show? Yes. Can you hide it? No. Can you blame somebody else? Yes. We'll get inferred to your version of events. Problem avoided. Or would an admission damage your career prospects? Yes, we'll sit tight and hope the problem goes away. So I've worked in 25 organizations. I've looked at a lot more than that. I don't know any organization of size that doesn't have a blame culture. And that has significant implications for what organizations learn. Next slide, please. And the flip side to a blame culture is Prozac leadership. Next slide, please. Because most organizations have blame cultures, the top rarely knows what the hell is going on in the organization. Next slide, please. So Prozac leadership, an unremittingly positive approach from the top, which encourages people at the top to believe their own propaganda. Nobody else believes it, but they do. And everybody else is discouraged from raising problems. So the corporate leaders are always surprised when things go wrong, given how well everything seems to be going. Next slide, please. Now, these are quotes from Allied Western military leaders in Afghanistan. I think these are good examples of Prozac leadership. General Barno, without question, 2004 will be a decisive year. General Abu Zaid, 2005 will be a decisive year. General Ritzes, 2006 will be the crunch year for the Taliban. General Shampoo, 2008 will be. There's a lot of decisive years in here. So either I knew nothing about Afghanistan, or what we're looking at is Prozac military leadership. And the people at the top of the organization either don't know or choose not to know what is actually going on the ground. Next slide, please. So we can summarize that by thinking about leadership as a wheelwright. This comes from a story about the Chinese Emperor Liu Bang, who consolidated China in the 3rd century BCE. And to the banquet came lots of guests. One of them couldn't understand why he was the emperor, because he wasn't a noble, nor did he appear to be an expert in anything. So he asked Chen Sen, the military expert, why is this man the emperor? And Chen said, well, what determines the strength of a wheel? And the guest said, the strength of the spokes. And Chen responded, two sets of spokes of identical strength do not necessarily make wheels of identical strength. The strength is also affected by the spaces between the spokes, and determining the spaces is the true art of the wheelwright. In other words, you don't actually need to be an expert to be successful facing wicked problems. All you have to do is surround yourself with people who are experts and give them some space to work. Next slide, please. So let me just summarize this by thinking about these 3 decision styles: command, management, and leadership, and these 3 criteria: space, time, and problem. I'm suggesting command is about tactical space, normally management, operational space, leadership, strategic space. The time you've got for a decision. Command is usually short-term, management medium-term, leadership long-term, and the kind of problem you're looking at. Command is for critical problems, management's for tame problems, and leadership's for wicked problems. Next slide, please. So command is just do it. I don't actually care what you think about this. Do it. Management is deja vu. You've been here before many times. You know what to do. Just roll the process out. And leadership is vu jardin. You have never been here before. And if you have, you've never been able to fix it. You need a collective view on what to do about this. Next slide, please. But the man at the bottom, Ezio his work on compliance, argued there are probably 3 reasons why people would want to follow you, which fits quite nicely with this topology. He talked about coercive institutions and coercive compliance. He was working in a prison at the time and argued if you work in a prison, you can force people to follow you. I'm suggesting you can force them to follow you if they think there's a crisis. You are the commander with the answer in your head, and you're doing it for the collective good. But most of us live in the central box, what he called calculative compliance. People will follow you there, not because you're forcing them, but because it's their job to follow you. It's therefore logical for them to comply. Fits with tame problems in the role of management, as I've defined it. And occasionally he talked about normative compliance. People will follow you there, not because you're forcing them, not because it's their job to follow you, but because they want to. This fits with wicked problems and the role of leadership, as I've defined leadership. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, this is where we end up. You are the decision maker inside this box, and the further you got the vertical axis, the more uncertain you are about what to do about the problem. And the further you go on the horizontal axis, the more collaboration you require. So when you're facing a critical problem, act as the commander, provide the answer. You get access to coercion or physical power. It's what Joseph Nye calls hard power, if you know Nye's work. Most of us live in the blue box most of the time, facing a tame problem. Act as a manager, organize the process. You get access to calculative or rational compliance. In the case you get a wicked problem for which you can't know what to do, your job, therefore, is to act as a leader, as I've defined it in this context, ask appropriate questions, and engage in high levels of normative or emotional collaboration, what Nye calls soft power. Next slide, please. So this slide you might like, the next 2 you won't. Some problems are so complex you have to be highly intelligent and well-informed just to be undecided about them. If you're not confused by your work, you probably hadn't understood it. Next slide, please. We are the ones we have been waiting for. Next slide, please. In other words, there is nobody coming to save you. It's basically up to you because the responsibility lies with us. It doesn't lie with them. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Keith. That was really excellent. And I feel in a much better position to resolve all my wicked problems now. But one thing I will say is that I wouldn't tell your family, the ones who you're with at Christmas, that there will be a recording of this webinar. So I trust you'll keep stum about that. Anyway, I think that moving on, James M. Durant III, who, as I've probably said, is a very good friend of mine, who is incredibly well connected, ex-colonel in the US Air Force, chief consul for the US Department of Energy, and most important of all, a fellow of the Institute for Responsible Leadership, of which we're very, very proud at the IRL. So thank you for joining us, James, at 2 levels. And would you like to present your slides now? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Sachs, and thank you, Professor Grint. That was informative. Wicked problems and responsible leadership. Leadership is the art and science of influencing change and behavior. Management, of course, is the effective utilization of people, money, material, time, and space. You mix those two together to get sustainable results. I would argue that responsible leadership is responsible governmental leadership is accountability. Let that sink in for a minute. Accountability. Now, the ethical administration of an organization for that leader is accountability. It is a sovereign's sworn duties to effectively manage matters of state, including health, environment, human rights, economic prosperity, justice, diplomacy, energy, transportation, infrastructure, and defense. Now, this concept of a responsible leaders are expected to put the needs of the organization up front. The priority is not self. The priority is the organization. A responsible leader sees the needs of the agency's interests as his or her primary duty, without regards to self or self-preservation, monetary aggrandizement, or political power. Now, as we talk about these wicked problems, not tame problems, not critical problems, I am influenced by the former UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld and the UN Security Council's collective veto power with the 5 major states: China, France, the Russian Federation, and the UK. Now, as you recall, he sought to ensure responsible collective leadership on a global scale. On matters of leadership, his words that he said in 1953 resonate today, and I like to repeat them. Our work for peace must begin within the private world of each use. To build a world without fear, we must be without fear. To build a world of justice, we must be just. And how can we fight for liberty if we are not free to fight in our own minds? How can we ask others to sacrifice if we are not ready to do so? Only true surrender in the interest of all can we reach that strength and independence, that unity of purpose, the equity of judgment, which are necessary if we are to measure up to our future. Next slide. This requires collaboration, leadership, and it's an adaptive approach. Incidentally, my comments are my own comments. They are not comments reflecting NATO, Energy, or any other organization which I'm a part of. Next slide. Conflict. What is this issue of conflict? And this is where we start when we deal with matters of responsible leadership. Conflict is a human experience. We engage in conflict every day. You have conflict with your brothers and sisters, as Professor Grant talked about a minute ago about his family. Conflict. It is as natural as getting up in the morning and taking a breath of air. It's not the issue of conflict, it's how we resolve conflict. I mean, as humans, we create artificial conflict. Take, for example, sports. You will ally yourself on one side and fight against another side. For what? The honor of being a victor. So this whole idea of conflict is a human challenge. Next slide. So these 4 areas: responsible government leadership. What is it? It is what I just mentioned: responsibility and accountability. And then you have the responsible leader. We must have a guiding principle for all of this. Next slide. And this guiding principle is the law, a set of principles or ideas that ensure an orderly and just society. More countries throughout the world strive to uphold this rule of law, where no one is above the law. Everyone is treated equally under the law. Everyone is held accountable to the same laws. There are clear and fair processes for enforcing laws. There is an independent judiciary, human rights, guaranteed for all. According to the UN rule of law, the rule of law is further defined as a principle or governance of which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with international rights and norms and standards. It requires measures to ensure adherence to the principles of the supremacy of law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation, decision-making, legal certainties, and the law itself. Is it right? Was it? No. Was South Africa's constitution right when it led to the incarceration of Nelson Mandela? The United States, its constitution, was it right in allowing the 50% of the republic in the United States not to vote women? And what about the case law presumptively flowed from the Constitution in the United States? In the United States, after Americans of African descent were freed, we had Jim Crow laws that existed for 100 years. So no, the law is not always right. Next slide. And as we speak to the application of sustainable goals, which Professor Grant so adequately stated, the relevance and the problems of leadership, the UN Sustainable Goals: no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable crisis, cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action. Now, I am informed by my adopted brother, Dr. Hippolyte Fofak. He's a former chief economist and director of research for the African Import Bank. Dr. Fofak, in his most recent publication, Africa's future must stand on the shoulders of a new Afrocentric philosophy, 26 April 2024. And I encourage you to look at it. He talks about philosophy, and that's what we're essentially talking about here. Philosophy should be an energy. It should find its aim and its effect in the amelioration of mankind. But then as we're talking here, we're talking about difficulties, right? And ideas. And he quotes John Maynard Keynes. The difficulty lies not in new ideas, but in escaping old ones, which ratify those brought up, as most of us have been, into every corner of our minds. Now we look onward. And as we talk about Africa and the issue of philosophy and intellectual leadership that enhances the foundation of collective consciousness and strengthening the sense of nation state and identity and coverage of unity in Africa. It has caused policymaking across the region to be reduced to managing balance of payment crisis, aggravated by the colonial development model of resource extraction. This is a wicked governmental issue, the consequence of benign neglect, and has led to the singular perspective or approach to policymaking. He talks about the unemployment rate, how they continue to rise since the Great Depression era across the entire region. For example, 30% alone in South Africa and Nigeria, 30% unemployment rate. The two largest economies on the continent, where 3 million new jobs are created annually. Well, this is far below the 18 million jobs needed per year. And then when you compare it to Asia and wicked problems, well, by preserving the philosophical and cultural heritage, Asia has enjoyed a favorable condition for a resurgence post-colonial world. Poverty is no longer an Asian problem. In 2000, for example, 75% of the poorest people resided in Africa. And as of late, 60% of the world's extreme poor live in the continent of Africa. My friends, that's less than $2.15 per day. And as we were talking about philosophy, which drives the collective action and binds Africa together, what is this philosophy? Dr. Fofek posits that it is a business model that will have to be first and foremost highly reflective and interpretive, as well as fully grounded in historical and philosophical realities that shape Africa's aspirations. Today, multinational corporations are operating in Africa, and they have polluted in ways of prosperity and left in a wake of a sea of economic and environmental poverty. More than any other region in the world, political and economic management in Africa has been underpinned by a highly extroverted model of institutional governance, by institutional models that are largely alien. Africa alone, its share of global trade has been decreasing. Multinational companies operating in Africa are not responsive to Africa, but to the shareholders in their countries. Okay, so what's the resolve? Hold multinational corporations responsible, strengthen the partnership between African states and domestic industry, create the right conditions for the emergence of global competitive African multinational companies. You see, this is responsible leadership. This is accountability, as we have talked about so eloquently today. Next slide. Oh,
I think that was it actually, James.
Okay, that was the last slide. All right, so now the last ending I would like to talk about is character, as we talk about leadership. And I like to give a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, who my father went to school with. And you all heard this quote: "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." What do you think about character when no one is watching, when you're under stress, when you place yourself over others? As we think about responsive leadership, and we think about character, the character of a nation, the character of those that rule the nation, and our sworn duties, our ethical duties, our human rights duties to this planet, going back to the Sustainable Development Goals, we must agree that our philosophy should be forward-thinking, forward-looking. We remember the past so we don't repeat the past, obviously, but we must continue to go forward. I thank you for your time, and I yield the floor.
Thank you very much, James. Very useful corrective in terms of, the wicked problems, because we can so easily sink, I think, in face of them. But you pointed a very positive way forward. So thank you very much for that, for your incisive comments. That's very good. And we move on to Brian, if we could have the next slide, please. I'm just about to introduce now Professor Brian Head, who's Professor of Public Policy in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland in Australia. And we thank Brian very much for joining us, because he's burning the midnight oil a little bit down there in Australia, just as James is doing an early morning slot in the USA. But we pride ourselves, under the UNITAR and IRL label of being international in scope, and we truly are today. So Brian, would you like to strut your stuff, please?
Sure. And could I have my first slide, please? So I've just got 4 slides, and I'm going to try and link what I'm saying back to some of Professor Grint's presentation, and also a bit of blatant advertising. I have a book out on wicked problems in public policy that is readily available. I get no royalties from it, so I'm not being particularly selfish, but a lot of these issues are elaborated at some length in the book. So what I want to say with you today is I agree utterly that it's very important for us all to start with thinking about the different types of problems that we are facing without getting paralysed by the complexities and the differences and so forth. But it's very important for analysts and for managers and for advocates and leaders to understand those differences. Some of them are routine and some are more urgent and some are more long-term, as Keith Grint has outlined so nicely for us. And I also agree with him and others that the capacity to understand these differences and to respond appropriately is really the crucial challenge that we face intellectually or cognitively. That these different forms of management and leadership are appropriate to different kinds of problems, but not just problems in their own right, but also in context, because if we're talking about the global south or the global north, if we're talking about rich and poor countries, if we're talking about countries which have strong institutional capabilities and some that don't, then the nature of the discussion and the characterisation of the problems and what we can do about it tends to run in different directions. Unfortunately, it's the case that national political leaders, and we're really talking mainly about governments here, often misdiagnose the nature of the problems and have their own personal favourites about what a solution looks like, put all their political reputation on the line around those solutions. And they also typically have rather weak motivation to progress on those large cross-border problems, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. So could I have the next slide, please? So the Sustainable Development Goals is a good entry point for a lot of these kinds of issues we're talking about, as James has also discussed in some depth. Unfortunately, a lot of governments around the world, and no names here, you can work out for yourself what fits. Often the difficult, wicked, conflictual problems are treated in very, very different ways for political advantage or because of lack of analytical capability or because of political histories or whatever it might happen to be. And I've categorised this into 4 forms. I say a lot more about this in my written work. But sometimes governments actually sidestep the problems. They're too hard. They don't want to take responsibility. They avoid them. They do not deny them. They do blame shifting, or they're engaged in some kind of symbolic reassurance rather than actually addressing the problems in a professional manner. Very often, they try and absorb the tough problems into administrative or managerial frameworks. adding on bits and pieces to existing programs, for example, and treating them as if they are management challenges, again, as Keith has said in some detail. And sometimes they take a particular view of urgency and threat and crisis management, declaring, for example, that it's a national emergency or a national security challenge, and that this justifies or requires centralised executive decision-making. Now, sometimes that's highly appropriate. Very often it might be highly appropriate, but there are a number of government leaders around the world for whom declaring a security emergency is cover for some other kind of agenda they may have. And finally, and more hopefully, sometimes responsible leaders will be a little more humble about how to navigate a difficult situation, confessing that, in fact, the nature of the problem is unclear and needs some discussion, and therefore the solutions are not clear. And for the reasons that Keith has elaborated, knowledge uncertainty, different value perspectives, all those things we're very familiar with, that constitute the basis for wicked and complex and intractable kinds of problems. Now, in those cases, and I want to spend a moment on this, in the case of wicked problems where responsible leaders take the view that we need to engage more with diverse stakeholders, including managers and experts and various other stakeholders, with a view to making sense of the situation, sharing information, clarifying diverse perspectives, but working most importantly on some kind of notion of goals and strategies and the basis for future cooperation. What we typically find is that in these wicked problems, having more science, more technical knowledge is useful, but it's never enough. What we really need is a secure kind of starting point around values and norms, talking about goals and objectives. These are central and these are inherently political. It's also the case that we sometimes get stuck because of gridlock that arises from, say, power relationships. Next slide, please. So what I've been saying on that previous slide is that we often get it wrong. There's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of arm wrestling and competition involved. And there's a lot of self-interest on the part of government elites. So is collaboration the solution? Well, I'm an optimist. I'm also a realist in terms of how tough that is. Where there is a high level of disagreement about the nature of the issues and priorities and what we should do about it, there's a good body of literature and practice, increasingly from practice, that more collaboration and more co-design is a great way forward if that is compatible with the political culture and the permissions that are available inside the governmental system. So a number of options are available quite concretely, various kinds of consultative mechanisms, advisory forums, taking stakeholders seriously. And it's partly about gathering information, but it's much more importantly about clarifying values and interests as a basis for charting some kind of common future pathway. In some governments, which have perhaps more resources and capabilities on the information side, holding major public inquiries can be extremely useful as a procedural tool to make some kind of progress on big issues. Certainly in my country, we do a lot of that, and we pride ourselves that we seek submissions from every part of the population, the experts, the ordinary citizens, and service delivery people, and so forth. There's a lot of small group problem solving through innovation labs or design labs. This is particularly common in the global north. There's a lot of countries that are doing this, perhaps on a fairly small experimental scale. Groups like the OECD are very much in favour of encouraging that kind of approach. There's a lot of work going on about behaviour change. In other words, not relying just on new laws and regulations, but trying to tap into the way ordinary people think, the way various stakeholder groups might be thinking about goals and the sort of social norms that could be mobilised to help move us in a common direction, or the kind of incentives and nudges and information that might help move things along. This would always be complementary to more formal codes and regulatory standards. It's not a substitute for it. We can't make a lot of progress purely through information. But over time and in principle, having a history of inclusive processes helps to promote a degree of trust and a degree of policy learning. And these kinds of things are incredibly valuable for us in taking these arguments forward. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of argument about at what level we should be operating. My answer is it depends, and probably we should be operating at every level. So some kind of multi-scalar response is appropriate in most cases. Some wicked problems have a global reach, and therefore having a macro scale is very important, but also to fill in all the gaps at local and regional levels. So there need to be initiatives and cooperative activity at every level. International organisations, including the ones that James was talking about, are incredibly important. International organisations can play an important leadership role. Many of you listening to this will have your own view about which international organisations are most trustworthy, most reliable, most helpful, what processes they're using are going to be most productive for the interests that you are most interested in. But a lot of it is to do with building commitment to shared goals and objectives and facilitating and publicising good practice strategies of various kinds. My own work on collaboration has found that collaboration only works once you have some level of agreement about purposes and directions. Collaboration for its own sake might be useful as a trust-building exercise, but if we're to make progress on wicked problems, we need to spend a lot of time developing a clear sense of purpose and direction. If we're taking seriously collaborative approaches and endorsing them and recommending them, we need to do a lot of work on understanding better how collaboration can work under different conditions, under conditions of crisis and stress. Perhaps there's a new research agenda for the scholars who are tuned into this discussion. But collaboration is not just one thing, it's 100 things, and it's very situational. And we need to get a better sense of fit for purpose and tailor the collaborative work to the situation and the challenge. And there's ongoing challenges about what's the information base, what's the best available evidence that we have access to when the integrity of the policymaking process is under threat. It's being undermined constantly by disinformation, by propaganda, and we therefore need to spend quite a bit of time paying attention to building trust in reliable sources of knowledge and taking seriously the knowledge that's made available to us through various stakeholder groups. So my final point is simply that many levels of deliberation globally are going to be required. Next slide, please. From high-level negotiations in various kinds of international forums, right through to in the streets, in effect. A lot of change processes are bottom up. They are motivated and driven by popular movements of one kind or another, whether it's for climate change being taken seriously, whether it's for human rights, whether it's for better forms of inclusion and deliberation. So all of these kinds of forums are going to be important into the future. Different wicked problems will require different forms of cooperation. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. That's added another level of granularity, as they say, to the wider issue of wicked problems, and we're very grateful for that. And I think we should now turn to Joanne Murphy, Professor Joanne Murphy. Next slide, please. Joanne is, just while that's coming up, Joanne is a Professor of Inclusive Leadership at Birmingham Business School, as it says on the slide, at the University of Birmingham. And we look forward very much to your comments, Joanne. You've got 10 minutes, so look forward to that. And then we'll have a little time for Q&A.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here, particularly to respond to all of the speakers, but especially to Keith, whose work is so seminal in this area. And even though I think many of us have read so much that Keith has written, you always learn something new, and learning something new about his Christmas dinner was a real treat, it has to be said. But if we could just move on to the first slide. I've only got a couple of slides, and I suppose maybe just the next one, that's just the title slide. So if we could just move on to the next one. So what I really wanted to do in this was, I suppose, to take things down another notch, really, in terms of talking about wicked problems, because one of the things that struck me, and we were very fortunate to have just a little peek at Keith's slides in advance, was his comment, and it's so true, that this whole area is just replete with failure, that we see so few success stories, so few processes that are moved into a genuinely better place. And I suppose in terms of my own research, I do a lot of work around leadership in lots of environments, but I suppose the one thing that I look at most is leadership within environments of conflict, and what may be called and have been called extreme contexts. And obviously, as someone who grew up in Northern Ireland, who grew up during the Northern Ireland conflict, I have a particular interest in how that conflict, which was so violent, so difficult, so destructive for such a long period of time, was moved from being a relatively, what journalists call low intensity conflict, although I have to say it didn't feel low intensity, when you were kind of growing up in it, but a low intensity conflict, which nevertheless resulted in the death of 3,500 people and the injuries of hundreds of thousands, and huge impacts, economic, political, social, psychological, for so many people. How that was moved from one position to another position, a position where while as with all wicked problems, the problem is never resolved. You never really get to a point where things are fixed, but certainly move to a position where it is at least much, much less violent in terms of how we operate. And I think that there are lessons within this very unusual story of success in terms of the management of a wicked conflict from one place to a better place, to not just other ethno-political conflicts. And of course, we all know that we're dealing with so many of these situations at the minute, particularly the really horrendous situation that we can see in the Middle East, but also other wicked problems, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about obesity, whether we're talking about these really complex phenomena that so many of us kind of faces, that we're faced with so often. So a little tiny bit of background in terms of the situation we were looking at in Northern Ireland. What you can see on this slide is a mural, a community mural in a loyalist area of Northern Ireland, which means that the people in this area, certainly the people that put up this mural, were people who were loyal to the British Crown and wanted to retain the link with Britain. These murals are incredibly common on both sides. They still are to a large extent within some communities in Northern Ireland, and they are, of course, inherently violent. And these kind of images are images which speak to us about division, about territory, and about holding and keeping territory rather than ceding it. And that says, I think, everything we need to know about the nature of some of these wicked problems, particularly what we see within ethno-political conflict, that these conflicts are generally regarded as entirely intractable. Certainly when I was a political science student during the Troubles, I was told by all of my political science academics that this was a conflict which could not be resolved, simply could not be brought to a better place. These ideas tend to be zero-sum in that for one party to win, the other party needs to lose. They tend to be incredibly historic in that they go back hundreds and hundreds of years. So again, you know, they fit this kind of typology of something that is wicked and goes way back in terms of our understanding of it. And they are, of course, in terms of how we look at these things, entirely devastating. And yet, even with all of these characteristics, the Northern Ireland conflict was brought to a much better place through what is generally known as the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And again, we're not saying that, you know, this incredibly difficult and transigent conflict has been resolved for all time, but we're saying that it has been brought to a much better and much less violent place in terms of how we're dealing with it. If we could just move on to the next slide. And so what I wanted to do today was just to talk about maybe some of the mechanisms that came into place in terms of the delivery of that much better place. Because I think these are what's really interesting. And I think these give us a little bit of a glimpse into some of the things that can actually work. And it has to be said, and again, it comes back to this work on wicked problems. Leadership sits at the absolute center of each of these processes. And that's the kind of key thing I want us to be thinking about. So what's the kind of first thing that we think about? The first thing is we think about this process of reframing. So, you know, we go from this zero-sum idea, whatever your wicked problem is, the idea of loss, and we think about reframing that problem into a different place. And I think reframing sits at the heart of a lot of these leadership challenges in terms of wicked problems. In Northern Ireland, what that meant reframing the problem away from a sort of Catholic, Protestant, nationalist, unionist, Irish, British kind of notion of what the conflict was about to something that said, actually, that's not the reality of this. This is a problem of three sets of relationships. The relationship between Ireland and Britain, which is an historic relationship of difficulty. The relationship between Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland in terms of partition. And then, and only then, the relationships that exist within Northern Ireland itself. Now that fundamental reframing, I would argue and have argued in my work, unlocked the problem to a certain extent, because suddenly you've got three relationships you can begin to think about. And then we also had something which is really interesting and I think relates to lots and lots of other contexts. Very often people talk about breaking down wicked problems. And again, it relates to some of the things that Keith was saying earlier. One of the things we saw in Northern Ireland was an expansion of the problem. We saw leaders who really understood what they were doing, taking the problem and exporting the problem into other environments. So suddenly the problem wasn't just an Irish problem. It was a problem that Dublin had to deal with in the Irish Republic. It was a problem always that London had to deal with, but now Brussels was involved in. And most importantly, of course, it was a problem that Washington had right on its agenda. So this problem expansion rather than problem contraction was incredibly important. We also saw what was an incredibly radical vision at the very beginning of this reframing process. You know, so it wasn't around something quite minor, you know, it wasn't around something small. It was a hugely significant radical agenda in terms of transforming entire relationships between countries, not just relationships in Northern Ireland itself. And then it also revolved around an extended engagement over decades and decades. This was not something that happened quickly. This was something that took a huge amount of time really to get to the bottom of. And of course, it was fundamentally liminal. So it required, as we've talked about earlier, this ability for leaders and those who were looking at the problem definition to be able to tolerate the ambiguity, tolerate the discomfort of being betwixt and between, but incredibly difficult to do right at the heart of the public gaze. And then this is, I think, what I really want people to think about, because, I believe that this is not something we talk about nearly enough whenever we're relating to this issue of wicked problems. In order to begin to deal with the reality of what collective responsible leadership meant within a shifting of the Northern Ireland problem, was leaders needed, and many people within the process needed, to really think about courage and what courage meant. Now, I think that within a lot of the time when we're talking about leadership, courage is very often mentioned within a general conceptualization of heroic leadership. And many of us are very critical, and I believe rightly so, of notions of heroic leadership. But I believe that we need to start thinking about courage quite differently, because I think courage actually sits outside that notion of heroic leadership. It's actually something else, because one of the things you see within this interesting case study in Northern Ireland is that leaders for the first time understood the cost of what change meant within this environment. And not only did they understand the cost, but they were also willing to pay the price. And for very many leaders involved in this process, that price was absolutely huge. So whenever we think about trying to unlock these wicked problems, I would really encourage people to begin to think about this issue of cost and begin to think about whether leaders really can pay the price, because that is not something which we really articulate in terms of the leadership around wicked problems. But the price is very, very, very significant. And so I know we only have a very short period of time today, but I think that trying to begin to disentangle that issue of political courage, of doing the right thing, of actually taking action, which will be harmful to you and your political career or your political future very often, is something we have to understand much, much better. What I only had
I think we'll have
couple
to tie up there, Joanne.
Okay.
Because we've got very little. We've only got 7 minutes left.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your. I mean, it's a really good example. I really love it to bits, because it's a classic wicked problem, and I think you've highlighted a number of dimensions of it. We are not, unfortunately, going to have any time for the panelists to come back, but I would say that from the chat that I've been following, it is actually relevant to say that people have been raising a number of issues. That people have loved the dialogue. They've been very complimentary about Keith's keynote. They've been complimentary about the panelists in terms of what they have all said. And they have highlighted some important issues, like who is responsible. If we're talking about responsible leadership to deal with these wicked issues, how is it the organization? Is it the state? Is it the UN? Who actually should take responsibility? And they've been fascinated by this issue about why do people follow particular leaders, their motivation and so on, because some are more or less able to take forward the agendas in a constructive way, as has happened in Northern Ireland. And so this is very important. And, the whole question of how do certain leaders come into power is also very relevant. I'm going to turn to Keith before I tie up, because we are limited to a 2:30 finish today because of the recording and so on. But Keith, would you like to just make any quick comments, a line or two just on what you've heard so far from the panelists? You're on mute, actually, Keith.
Sorry. just one thing, and it relates to something that Joanne was just talking about at the very end, which is about we need leaders who are willing to pay the price. And one of the people that I think writes best about that is a German academic called Enzensberger, who wrote a paper called "The Heroes of Retreat," and he argues. I'll just take what example of what he's talking about. When we think about ANC and the kind of removal of apartheid in South Africa, we normally connect that to Mandela as the hero. And what Endenberger argues is we also have to think about the importance of F.W. de Klerk in this, because what de Klerk did is become the hero of retreat. He basically tells the white South Africans that apartheid is finished, the game is up, they cannot continue, and the only way to ensure South Africa continues is to cede power democratically. So what F.W. de Klerk does is ruin his own reputation. In other words, he pays the price. So I think we also, so beyond the kind of heroism of Mandela and things that we normally get stuck on, it's also worth thinking about the importance of those people that pay the price and do something which is for their followers often deeply, deeply unpopular, but needs to be done.
Yeah, thank you for that, Keith. I think that's a really important point, which I'm definitely sign up to. I mean, Mandela was, is a great role model, but we need to understand also the role of de Klerk in all this. Could we take the next slide, please? Because I think what I'm going to have to do now is to sum up before the guillotine comes down, as they say. Because I think we've heard some fantastic views, some of the bear traps which are around in terms of how you deal with wicked problems, just to provide some closing remarks, and how we need to perhaps as you've said, Keith, get used to uncertainty and be prepared to live. I mean, Joanne has also illustrated that with the case of Northern Ireland. We need to work over extended timescales, and I think Brian has said very nicely about the need for collaboration. And James, I like James's comments about government needs to put what's happened in the past behind it, to try and work in affecting change, to take responsibility for moving things forward in a positive direction. And this also ties up with Joanne's point about the need for leaders to have courage, very important in terms of moving forward. But what I'd like to do, just as a conclusion, if you could just move on the slides, please, is just to publicize, do my own form of publicity. Brian has done his for his Wiki Problems book, but to do my own form of publicity for this book, which came out a year or so ago, on responsible leadership essential to the achievement of the UN Sustainable Goals, which is really very much an IRL UNITAR collaboration, which covers many of the wicked problems that we're perhaps alluding to here in terms of the UN: cybersecurity, labor trafficking, health, education, climate change, and so on. So we would commend that to you, and all the details are on the Routledge website. And finally, just in the last minute or so, just go on to the last stage, please, the last slide. I would, just while that's coming up, I would like to really thank all the participants. I mean, I think that every single one of you today, Keith with his keynote and everything, which has been brilliant, in terms of the template for understanding these things, and all of the panelists, Joanne, James, and Brian. You've done a fantastic job in dealing with this subject and dissecting it. And I would like to thank you all so much. And I would like to also thank the audience for the questions that they've posed and all the issues that they have raised on the chat function. So thank you very much, everyone. And I think at that point, we'll have to leave. So goodbye. Okay. Yeah, good.